Hey, welcome back to the show. And joining us today is Russell Zirkle, who is a former assistant warden with the Georgia Department of Corrections. He's also a Army reservist, and he's joining us here today to share his thoughts as it relates to what he is seeing and observing out there in the Georgia, excuse me, prison system, if you will. And Russell, it's good to meet you. I know Tyler introduced us. Obviously, for those tuning in, Tyler is a whistleblower, I should say, as far as his experiences as a correctional officer. And Russell, I know you expressed an interest in sharing your story, and so I'm grateful to have you on today, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, likewise, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be able to speak on some of the issues going on and let people know, raise awareness of what the Georgia Department of Corrections is facing, what the people of Georgia are facing, what the public needs to know essentially.
Well, judging by what I've heard from Tyler, it sounds like the state prison system is severely understaffed, and it's basically Planet of the Apes over there to some extent, and in need of much reform. So I guess if you can situate us as it relates to what has gone on and what currently is going on that the viewers should be aware of pertaining to this prison system and your experiences.
Well, I could describe their situation that they're in right now as nothing short of a calamity, nothing short of a disaster. Critically understaffed as it is. I mean, you're talking some facilities 70, 80% vacancy rates, especially your state prisons, your close security, your medium security, state correctional facilities. A lot of your senior staff are flocking more towards your transitional centers. I guess the shorthand term would be, halfway houses, probation detention centers, some of the places that are extremely easy to manage, compared to your state prisons. Some of them might have a population of 300 inmates, and they don't even call them inmates. So a lot of your senior staff that, are wanting to stay with the department, they're transferring to those different satellite facilities. And so some of those facilities are almost fully staffed, if not fully staffed. So really even the numbers that the state is presenting are skewed because yeah, you might say, well, we're 50% staff, 60% staff. Well, you're skewing the numbers with the transitional centers, the halfway houses, the probation detention centers, the smaller satellite facilities. They might be fully staffed, but then you might go to, Telfair State Prison, Hancock State Prison, Smith State Prison, Valdosta State Prison, Macon State Prison, Autry State Prison, Calhoun State Prison. You might go to some of them and see a 70 to 80% vacancy rate. I mean, a fraction of the correctional officers needed to run one of those correctional facilities. You're housing some of the more violent, more problematic inmates in the state. The facilities, one of the facilities that I worked at, I think they said 15% of the guys that house there have life without parole, and about 40% altogether have life sentences. They're never going home. And if they do have a base life sentence, I believe it's 30 years before they can even be considered for parole. Likely, a lot of those guys are never going home. So it's nothing short of a crisis that they're going through right now. But the way they would present it and tell the public, everything's okay, we're handling it, and I mean, it's laughable. If you saw some of the things that I've seen, that Tyler's seen, it's a joke for them to be saying that they're handling it, that they're managing it well. So a myriad of issues, but I'd say most of the issues, and even a lot of the ones that Tyler described to you, they're just byproducts of the base issue, which is a lack of urgency from the executive management. You got to wonder what's going on in the governor's office, what's going on in the commissioner's office, because they're asleep in the chair right now. They fell asleep at the wheel. That with the numbers, with the staffing numbers that Georgia is facing right now, it's alarming. It's insane that they're not offering hiring bonuses, that they're not dramatically increasing the salaries. I know a few years back they increased the salary to like 10% more, which I think COs there now start at around 43,000 a year, which is really low compared to a lot of your correctional facilities that neighbor Georgia. They're not facilities, your correctional agencies that neighbor Georgia. Florida Department of Corrections pays their officers more. Tennessee Department of Corrections, I mean, they're starting COs at 60 plus a year. And the base salary is, that's something that they should have changed years ago. I started with a department in 2015, and my starting salary was $25,000 a year. Which in 2015 in Georgia, I know, especially somebody like you that, lives where you live, and that would even, there's no way you could live on that. And in Georgia, at the time, that was quote unquote livable. I had a like a 2 bedroom house at the time, and I got by. But Georgia Department of Corrections, they went 10 years without giving their employees a raise. I think the last raise they gave before, I think first raise I got was 2016. I think it was more than 10 years. They went 10 plus years without giving their employees a raise. They're not adjusting for cost of living, inflation, and a lot of people left. A lot of people went to find something else to do. A lot of people, if you're not paying enough, man, people aren't going to stick around. And I truly think that the situation they're in now, it's just a monument to the sins of the past. Not giving the employees raises for 10, 11, 12 years. Not responding to issues that your employees brought up years ago. My father, he retired from the Georgia Department of Corrections. He retired as an assistant superintendent, and he's a lot like me. He's not just going to sit idly by and you know I hate to use profanity, but you're not going to piss down my neck and tell me it's raining. And that's essentially what some of the executive management. The position I left is assistant warden. You know, I I wanted to get in executive management. I dreamed to be a warden one day, a regional director, which is your warden's boss. They're typically over three, four, five prisons in that region. A couple more actually. I dreamed of being a commissioner, being over that department, and really making a change. That's truly why I had the aspirations that I did. As did my father. He went through some health things late in his later years that forced him to medically retire. But once I got to the position that I left as assistant warden, I quickly realized that these people, they don't actually care. They don't actually care about changing things. I mean, you essentially had to sell your soul to be in that position. You had to keep quiet. You couldn't tell people what was really going on. You couldn't tell the COs that, hey, you're in grave danger. You're working, 300 to 1 as far as inmates to staff ratio. And you couldn't give some kind of rebuttal to the bosses, the regional directors, the warden. I mean, they essentially just told you to shut up and do your job with a fraction of the staff that you needed to do your job. And I mean, even as a deputy warden, I mean, I was pulling 65, 70 hours a week. My phone ring constantly, even when I was off, Saturdays. I was off Saturdays and Sundays, schedule wise, but my phone never stopped ringing, which I don't complain about that. It's more so, we didn't have enough staff to run the facility, man. And that's going on at essentially every one of your state prisons there in Georgia. And they're sweeping it under the rug. They're putting a muzzle on the people that want to speak out about the things going on. The people they do still have working there, they can't say anything, or they'll get fired, disciplined. Um, and then a lot of I mean, they've lost so many people over the years. They've lost. I mean, I could tell you so many. I can name at least 25 people that I worked with throughout the years that they're no longer employed with the Georgia Department of Corrections. A lot of them, like myself. I mean, I love that agency, and it's the family business for me. And I enjoy protecting the state of Georgia. Keeping the public safe. Putting up with the grueling hours and the work that you had to do at. I loved it, and I realized towards the end of my tenure that I can't make a difference here, because what am I going to become a warden, and some regional director's telling me to do something that's you know in the grand scheme of things is ethically wrong. Going to tell me to lie on staffing reports, going to tell me that to act like everything's okay. But yeah, like I said, some of the things Tyler brought up, some of the experiences that I had were very similar. Running, the institution I was at housed around, I think, 1,300 inmates, and about 1,000 of those were close security. They were about the toughest there are to manage. Mental health, mental health has become a large concern for most correctional agencies around the nation are facing those challenges. But you were managing 1,000 inmates, close security inmates with 3 or 4 COs and one lieutenant. Maybe on a good day, 5 or 6 COs, maybe a lieutenant, maybe a sergeant. So there's nothing short of distress, of grave danger that Georgia Department of Corrections is in right now.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's the lack of urgency from the executive management. It's not really a trade secret. It's not really, you know, you can go down the rabbit hole of, well, this is going on, this is going on. I think, when I came in 2015, I think Georgia Department of Corrections was on the downturn at the time. We were on 12-hour shifts. I think 2 years prior to that, they had switched to those 12-hour shifts. They were on 8-hour shifts before that. It was like a 6 on, 3 off schedule. You'd work 6 8-hour shifts in a row, be off 3 days. And then when I came in, they transit, like I said, 2 or 3 years prior to that, they transitioned to 12-hour shifts. And I remember coming sitting in the briefing room, which is where the shift supervisor would, basically do roll call and put out any announcements of new things happening, things to watch out for, and they would, issue the assignments for everybody where they're working at, who's doing what, essentially. And I remember it was 40 to 45 some odd COs in that briefing room when I started in 2015. I mean, I couldn't even get a chair as a rookie. I couldn't even get a place to sit. I mean, I'm standing up with my bag, my food, my lunch, my, anything that I needed for the day. I'm standing up while the shift supervisor's giving their brief. And you go into that same briefing these days, and it's 3 or 4 people around you. So I'd say that the critical sin that Georgia committed over the years was, too little, too late. I like to point towards, sports franchises. Sports, it's not apples to apples, but, it's the greatest reality show in America, watching what's going on in the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball. If you like hockey, the National Hockey League, you got your bad organizations and you got your good ones. You got your good organizations that make good moves, make good decisions, promote the right people. The Kansas City Chiefs, look at what they've been doing. The Patriots for years. Um, then look at your bad organizations, the New York Jets, the Atlanta Falcons. That's my team. Everything that is wrong, every person that you you shouldn't promote, that you should bring into your organization, they'll do it. And everybody in the public watching is like, oh, that's probably not going to work. But yet they do it. They think they're smarter than you. They think they know better. And, that would sum up what Georgia Department of Corrections is doing. And, bad decisions on their part. I mean, your board of corrections is something that I don't hear a lot of people talk about. I haven't heard Tyler speak about it, but your board of corrections is a board of members that decide who your commissioner is going to be. I think they consult with the governor in some kind of way, but they essentially handpick your executive management staff, your assistant commissioners, your commissioner. I do believe they have a say in your regional directors, your field operations director. Well, actually, I think they call that facilities director. He's over all the regional directors. It's just, levels of management, chain of command. You're familiar with that. But your board of corrections, they just pick the wrong people. The commissioner they have right now, his name's Tyrone Oliver. He comes from police. He comes from policing. I believe he worked in several different police departments. He's been in management before, no question. Leader of men, so to speak. And I do want a leader of men before I want somebody that knows everything about everything and is not good for people. But to put somebody that has no correctional experience over one of the largest criminal justice systems in America. I don't know that you're aware of this, but I think per capita, Georgia incarcerates the most people in the nation. I had to double check on that. And Yeah, but Georgia Department of Corrections, they're picking the wrong people. Their Board of Corrections selected a commissioner that has no experience in corrections. And why would you put somebody as the head of your agency, essentially the person that everybody beneath him is going to look for guidance, for leadership and knowledge? Why would you pick somebody that doesn't have experience, not only in not only no experience with Georgia, but no experience in corrections, period? When I first started with the department, the commissioner was a dude by the name of Homer Bryson. He had an experience in agriculture. This dude comes from, oil and farms and, things like that. Like, what would this dude know about transporting a prisoner? What would this dude know about, the inmate on staff assaults? What would this dude know about that? So if you pick the wrong people, you're in trouble. And I bring that back to the sports franchise thing. If you pick a bad general manager that drafts poorly, if you pick a bad head coach that doesn't know what he's doing, if you pick bad players, or if you have poor training facilities, you have poor management of your salary cap, if you have poor management of your money, your resources, then you're going to struggle. Then you have no chance competing with those well-run organizations who are going to do the exact opposite of that. Look at Georgia. They should look at their neighbor state, Florida Department of Corrections. Florida Department of Corrections, their secretary, which is the equivalent of the commissioner, he's the highest ranking official over that agency. Dude by the name of Ricky Dixon, comes from being a CO. He went through the ranks with that agency, and he loves the people that work for him. He loves being the head of that agency. He loves what he does, the ability to enable change in the state of Florida. In Florida facilities, they got the problems too. I was employed for about 8 months with the Florida Department of Corrections. I won't say what facility, but I was employed there for about 8 months until I left to go to the agency that I'm with now. And yeah, they had their problems, but first world problems compared to Georgia Department of Corrections. I mean, they called themselves short of staff, and I think the shortest I ever saw them run the facility was at nighttime once with, like 20 COs and like 4 or 5 sergeants, a captain. I mean, they had people. I mean, they had people walking around. They had a male presence there. Tyler spoke on it. Georgia Department of Corrections, nothing but female staff. And to the I can't speak on why that is. Tyler touched on it a little bit. A lot of your male officers, they left. They were getting caught up in uses of force. They were getting run out essentially. And the machismo and the style of working for Georgia Department of Corrections facility, it essentially got phased out. When I first came in, we didn't mess around with inmates. Inmate told an inmate to do something that, a lawful order, go back to your housing unit, go, or in segregation, move your arm so I can close the tray port, the tray slot, I'm sorry. They didn't do it. You made them do it, and at the end of the day, it was a closely knit team and everybody did what they had to do to get out of there safe, but in Georgia, like I said, they ran all the male COs off. But I'm working in Florida, and I'm looking around, and they've got officers, they've got well trained officers, they've got males, they've got people with seniority there, they've got new people, but there's a great culture there, and that's something that people throw around the word culture a lot. And culture, I believe, culture derives from the standard that your management sets. And when your management tell you that they don't care, why do you think your line staff are going to care? They're not. And Georgia, they promote, sorry about that, the wind's picking up a little bit. In Georgia, they promote somebody to be the head of the agency that has no correctional experience. And then all of your assistant commissioners, it seems to be that they prefer the people that came through with care and treatment, with rehabilitation, with education backgrounds. They promote those kind of people. They don't promote your people that come through the security side, the custody side. They don't promote those kind of people. Those kind of people don't make it up to the executive ranks. And when they do, they're probably run out of town. The kind of wardens that they like for people to be these days. They're promoting a lot of wardens that didn't come up with the right experience. They're ill prepared for what they'll be tasked with managing. A lot of them, I wouldn't even say a lot of them, I wouldn't even say your wardens, your deputy wardens. They're not all bad people. They're not all selling their souls, as I referred to earlier. But a lot of them are ill prepared for what they're dealing with because they don't have the experience. They don't know what they're supposed to know. And if you worked in those ranks, if you worked in those cell blocks, those housing units, if you work different posts, segregation, perimeter patrol, the front entry areas, the control room, if you worked in those areas, you would know what it takes to run a facility because the very framework for running a correctional facility is your custody staff. You do need other staff there. I'll put you in as good as I can. I'll paint a picture for you with how, what all it takes to run a prison. You need correctional officers, you need supervisors of correctional officers, you need management, chief of security, your captain, you need assistant wardens, you need wardens, you need food service staff, you need staff members there that supervise the inmates in preparation of the food that they serve to the inmates. You need maintenance workers, guys that have expertise in fixing things because things break in correctional facilities. So you need people that work in the maintenance department. You need people that work in HR. You need people that work in the business office that, do all kinds of things. They manage expenditures of training. They manage expenditures of things that we spend on the inmates. Their food. Um, Different things they give them, the TVs they buy them, the funds that are accumulated from the inmates that, use the commissary, that the store bought goods essentially, the snacks, the noodles, the snack cakes, things like that they get from the inmates that purchase those things. They manage the money in the business office, but long story short, you need a whole lot of different departments to run a correctional facility. You don't just need COs. But none of that matters if you don't have CO. None of that matters. Oh, not to mention you need medical staff, you need psychiatric and psychology staff, you need people that work in the education department, teachers, counselors that manage caseloads and help the inmates enroll in the programs and classes that they need to be in to help them change their ways of thinking. But none of that works if you don't have proper custody staff. And in Georgia, they seem to prefer those people that came through those other departments versus the people that come through the custody department, what Georgia calls the security department, correctional officers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains. Yeah, a lot of them become wardens, but not a lot of them become regional directors. Not a lot of them become commissioners. Since I was employed with the agency, not one single commissioner was somebody from that department. And that's a problem because what are they going to know about this agency? Like I said, Florida Department of Corrections, their guy essentially is, one of them. He came from that agency. I watch videos on their social media all the time of him delivering messages in the Florida Congress about the desperate need for funds, the desperate need for um, those funds for use of, for more technology, for more COs, for more hiring events, for bigger hiring bonuses. This dude is going to bat for those people that work in that agency for him, and I'm sure you can attest to it. Any well-run agency, any element, I'll just use military jargon, platoon, a troop, a company, a battalion. You need good leadership, and if you don't have good leadership, you're going to suffer for it, and that's inescapable. If you have poor leadership, if you could have the best employees, and you put a poor leader to supervise those employees, it's going to go bad. You could put a bunch of substandard employees, and you give them good leadership, good guidance, somebody at the head that's gonna fight for them, gonna discipline them, gonna develop them, and then essentially, or most importantly, give them what they need to do their job. They're gonna succeed. So I'd say the biggest issue facing Georgia is who they put in charge of their department, because all the choices made thereafter, they all happen because of the poor leadership, the people that don't know what they're doing at the top, and they really don't know what they're doing.
Could you share perhaps some of the incidences that have occurred? If you care to share any anecdotal accounts that either you have observed personally or you have heard of as it relates to the inmates.
Sure. Some of the more alarming things that I dealt with while I was employed there, mostly things that were directly correlated with staffing. Even as an assistant warden, I had to be involved with several uses of force. I mean, you don't have to be an expert in corrections to know that. Why is your assistant warden assisting with a use of force? And to paint a picture for what a use of force is, you know, you tell an inmate something that's a lawful order and he doesn't do it. Well, if it's something that has to be done, if you're telling an inmate in general population to do something and he doesn't do so, and it's an offense to the level of, okay, we're going to take this guy to restrictive housing, which is, all the different jargon terms: solitary confinement, restrictive housing, segregation, and he doesn't want to go. He refuses to put his hands behind his back. He's not. He says he's not going. Well, you would use force to get him to do so. Whether that be OC spray, the use of the taser, hands-on force, which we try to stay away from. But, at the end of the day, we've got to get this dude handcuffed, got to take him to segregation. Well, your assistant wardens don't typically help with that kind of stuff. But due to the lack of staff, the facility I was at, and due to the lack of male staff, you're dealing with violent male offenders. You're dealing with guys that, you know, at the drop of a hat can become assaultive, that can become disorderly. And, in those kind of instances, you need people with the, how do I say this? You need people with the ability to restrain those guys, and a female can only do so much. I'm not here to trash, female officers. I'm not here to do that. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with male prisoners, you need male staff. Like Tyler touched on. You would rather have a 70-30 ratio of males to female officers, if not more, maybe 80-20, when you're talking about male correctional institutions. And being that, with the agency that I work with now, I actually work with female offenders. And I see how it is there. And you typically need more female officers working there. But when you're working at a male institution, you need male officers. And there was countless times where I became involved with uses of force because I didn't want somebody to get hurt. I didn't want a situation to go left and for somebody to get hurt or somebody to do something that they might regret because, hey, this guy's overpowering you, so you did something dirty to, try to cause him harm because you didn't have any options because you're a woman essentially. And so I became involved with several uses of force. I took inmates on hospital transports. When I was a captain at the facility before that, I was also at Alter State Prison um, as a captain. Um, but when I was the captain there, that was the chief of security position. It was lower than assistant warden, but it was essentially like anybody that's military is essentially army specifically. It's essentially like your first sergeant. He's really the guy in charge, and while he might not be at the top, he's pretty much the one that runs your facility. And I had to be the shift supervisor several times, or several. I mean, more than I can count. I was a shift supervisor so many different times when I was employed there. I got involved with uses of force just as I did when I was the deputy warden. And Tyler touched on it, but there's been times where through a whole night from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., which is the overnight shift hours, there was not one correctional officer assigned specifically to the housing unit. I remember as a captain, me and my lieutenant at that facility, we would count the inmates we would count every single inmate at the entire facility ourselves. I remember there's if I recall 5 different counts that happened on the night shift. Where the basis of working in custody is, you know, to keep inmates from escaping, to keep them there. Essentially that's the number one job, right? To keep them there, to protect the public. That's what the fences are for. That's what the razor wire's for. But counting in inmates, keeping track of how many you have there is the most important way that we monitor whether an inmate's escaped. But about 1,300 inmates, if I remember correctly at the time, housed at that facility. Me and the shift lieutenant, we counted every single inmate that night 5 times. I mean, I was so tired at the end of that night. I don't know. I didn't know how they do it. I don't know how they do it with, they don't have COs at these facilities, man. I mean, I don't even I don't see how they're getting away with what they're doing. If in 2024, October of 2024, the Department of Justice, which they are the primary agency charged with monitoring the compliance of the PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. It was an act passed by George Bush that it aimed at reducing sexual violence and sexual harassment in your correctional facilities nationwide by establishing protocols, reporting methods, definitions of what kind of sexual violence it was. There was all this different stuff that it implemented, and most correctional agencies nationwide accepted. I think there's two that I know of that don't accept it. I think Arkansas is one of them. And it's not mandatory, but you lose a lot of funding if you don't become compliant. So essentially, yeah, I don't have to do it, but they're going to give me $8 million of federal funding if I am compliant. So, um, anyways, the Department of Justice, the agency that's primarily responsible for that, they actually issued like an 82-page report in October of 24. It was a findings report that they had conducted while they throughout the years they would do visits, authorized visits, and just kind of monitor things and audit things of see how things were going. And they issued like an 82-page report of these findings that essentially was saying that Georgia Department of Corrections were running their facilities in an unconstitutional manner, that they were violating inmates' Eighth Amendment rights of cruel and unusual punishment, because to you're subjecting inmates to things that they weren't incarcerated for. You're subjecting inmates to being jumped by gangs, guys robbing them, you know, being forced into sexual violence. You don't have the COs to monitor these inmates. So in that situation, the inmates are running the facility. And your different security threat groups, your gangs, your Bloods, your Gangster Disciples, your Crips, different Hispanic gangs, Serranos, MS-13, uh, Latin Kings. Gangs are essentially running your facilities right now. Well, anyways, they issued this 82-page report of these findings, and I read every single page, and it was spot on. I mean, everything that was in there was completely true, unequivocally true, unimpeachable. And Georgia Department of Corrections actually came out and denied it, and um, they actually punched back and said, "Hey, listen, a lot of those things you put in there aren't true, and even the things that are, all these correctional agencies nationwide are facing some of the same issues we are, and we're working on fixing them. And two, the agency that the Department of Justice manages, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, their prisons are facing the same things that you guys are um, saying about us in this report. So essentially, like I said, I hate to use profanity, but they essentially told the Department of Justice to fuck off. Essentially, they basically told them like, "Hey, we don't care what you got to say." And I believe the Department of Justice, I believe they issued an injunction there on after. I don't know where they're at legally with that whole thing, but they basically mandated them, hey, fix these things because you're subjecting inmates to cruel and unusual punishment right now. Because you have the obligation as a correctional agency to run your facilities in a quote unquote safe and orderly manner. And the only way to do that is with enough COs, with controls in place. We search inmates. We make sure they don't have things. We make sure they don't have things they're not supposed to have. We make sure that inmates don't escape. We make sure that inmates aren't being subjected to physical violence. by other inmates. And like Tyler said, those things are going to happen even if you are staffing your facility. Those things happened even when I was there, when there was 40, 45 COs on shift. Those things still happen because criminals, specifically the gang members, they're relentless, man. They're relentless. And some of these street gangs that have infiltrated the prisons, they're going to do what they're going to do regardless. But when you have minimal amount of staff, you don't have anything to combat those issues. You don't have enough COs to search the inmates. You don't have enough COs to properly staff those units. As Tyler said, your close security prisons, they're supposed to be supervised. Those inmates are supposed to be supervised at all times. Those are some of the more problematic ones to manage. And when you give them the ability to not be supervised for large amounts of time, these guys brandish weapons. These guys figure out ways to have contraband smuggled into the facility, drugs, cell phones, paraphernalia, sometimes even weapons. I mean, I think Tyler touched on it. They had a pistol smuggled into Smith State Prison back, I think last year. I want to say it was like a year and a half ago. But they had a pistol smuggled into the facility, and one of the inmates that had a relationship with one of the kitchen workers, one of the, food service workers that I referenced earlier. He had a relationship with her, completely unauthorized, had she been caught, she would be a labeled sex offender and be convicted of, not convicted, but be, charged with, sexual assault, with a violation of, well, I don't know if it'd be violation of oath because they don't take an oath, but something she wasn't supposed to be doing. But after the fact, they found out. But I guess they had broken up, had fallen out, and the inmate didn't like how it happened, and he shot her inside the correctional facility. Um, I had to go look and see where it happened, and I think it happened in the back of the food service area. But something that a line that we thought would never be crossed. Even when the inmates were smuggling in contraband, even when probably for years they could have gotten a pistol, a firearm in the facility, they just wouldn't do that. Because of the minimal staffing that I referenced, a lot of your gang members, your inmates that are engaged in illicit activities rather, on the outside, a lot of them have no interest in trying to escape. You know, they it, I'd say the one saving grace that Georgia's had of why they haven't had more escapes, they have a pretty good perimeter defense system. They have a pretty good infrastructure built around the outside to keep inmates from escaping. They got a ton of razor wire. They got a alarm system that will tell you when somebody touches the fence. Um, that's probably why more inmates haven't escaped, but a large amount of the inmates there, they no interest in escaping. They're comfortable right there where they're at. They have a phone. They have a lot of them have civilian clothing. I mean, they're guys. I saw guys in there when I was at Ultra with Nike tees, with Jordan shoes. You know, guys that they had no interest in escaping, and what they're doing to smuggle the contraband in there. Georgia stepped up their search procedures in your entrance areas, like where you would go to enter the prison if you're going to work or, going in for an interview or what have you. They've stepped it up as far as the procedures there. I mean, it's almost like going through TSA to get inside. Sometimes you got to take your shoes off, or they have this big scanner that scans your whole body. But the inmates now resorted to, as long as they have one cell phone on the inside, they can have one of their friends, one of their associates on the outside fly. They're flying these drones. These drones that, you could buy from Academy. You can buy one of these things from Academy, and some of the higher end ones can, carry 20, 25 pounds, probably more than that of, whatever they want to put, so that these guys would bag up cell phones. These guys would bag up tobacco, methamphetamine, marijuana, any kind of other illicit drugs you can think of, illicit contraband, and they're just having it dropped in different places in the correctional facility. And like I said before, you don't have enough COs to monitor that. So all it takes is for that one inmate to either figure out a way to jump this fence that's on the inside, or figure out a way for to coerce this officer to let them through this gate somewhere they're not supposed to be, and they go pick it up. and they bring it back to the facility, and boom, it's a exponentially challenging thing to manage because while you might have only had 5 cell phones in that I wouldn't say facility, you got 5 cell phones in that cell block. Well, now you got 15 because 10 of them just came in through a drone. So yeah, they're going through it, man. They're going through it in Georgia, Department of Corrections facilities, and like I said, I don't see how they're getting away with what they're doing. When I was employed with Florida, you know, if they didn't have enough staff to to man the facility for the next shift, they made people stay over for another shift. In Florida Department of Corrections, they're on 8-hour shifts, and they'd make their officers stay over for another 8 hours. And a lot of times people didn't like it, but you had a slew of people that volunteered to do that kind of stuff because they wanted the overtime money, they wanted the extra pay. And but they held the line. They didn't abandon buildings. They didn't abandon cell block cell blocks from being supervised. They didn't do things like that. They held the line. They did whatever they had to do. They called people to come in. They made people stay over. They got volunteers. Hell, I even saw the colonel come in, to come run. Um, it was one of the meals. I think it was the breakfast meal. Came in just to supervise the inmates while they were doing that because we didn't have a lot of staff when I was employed there. But I don't see how they're getting away with what they're doing. I mean, Florida, like I said, they had controls in place to maintain that staffing level, and they aggressively tried to bring people in. They were raising salaries. They were offering sign-on bonuses. They were offering I want to say when I left, it was like $6,000 to $8,000, which is not a ton. I mean, I've seen the agency I work for now, they were offering 15K to come in, and they gave it to me all on the first paycheck. I mean, so they're desperately and aggressively venturing to bring people in to fill those vacancies because they see that as a urgent thing. They see that as this is a no fail mission. We have to get this done. Somehow, some way we have to get this done. And in Georgia, they don't see that as a no fail mission. They say, it is what it is. If we get it done, we do. If not, who cares? Like Tyler referenced years ago, they started making people stay over for 24-hour shifts. They started I mean, I remember when I was at Altria as a captain, I mean, I pulled a 36-hour shift one time, man. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, I started hallucinating because I'd just been awake for so long, and I think, like I referenced before, when they made the mistakes that they made throughout the years, I think they made a grave mistake by switching over to 12-hour shifts because while personally I preferred 12-hour shifts, it was convenient for me. 12-hour shifts don't give you some of the options that you had that I referenced before about, hey, we got this guy on an 8-hour shift. We can just make him stay over and do a 16-hour shift. And that guy can be back for work the next day. Well, if you make somebody to stay over for a 24-hour shift, they can't stay for the next shift. Or, they can't come in for their shift the next day. You know what I mean? So I think, having a system in place where you can get people to come in early, you can get people to stay over. All of my corrections people watching this video, they know what I'm talking about. Mandates. When the shift supervisor tells you got to do another 8 hours, or whether you were made to do it, or whether you volunteered, that was a tool in their tool belt to use to mitigate staffing concerns. And when they went to 12-hour shifts, when they likely didn't have to. Like I said, I want to say it was like 2013 they switched to 12-hour shifts, but they used to be on 8-hour shifts. But had they done what their neighbor agency Florida was doing, hey, let's just start making people stay over. Let's develop an overtime issuance process. Let's come up with ways to make this better. They didn't do anything. And to use a baseball analogy, when you're going up to the plate, you got to have some kind of approach. Well, you can have an approach. I'm swinging for the fence, or I'm poking one to right field to move the runner. You got to have some kind of approach. But if you have no approach, you're gonna get steamrolled. You don't have a chance. In Georgia, they have no approach. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying most of my things that I've witnessed. Um, most of the things that I've witnessed were staffing related, and they were just byproducts of of not having enough staff to do the job. But I'll tell you one instance that I remember that this is when I really decided that I was going to leave that agency. And mind you, what I did was unprecedented. You know, leaving as an assistant warden, I was on track to be a warden. I was highly favored by a lot of the key leaders that ran that organization because I was just no nonsense. I worked really hard. I came to work, and I really cared. And I think I was on track to be a warden. But I left that position of assistant warden to go be a CO. I mean, I bumped all the way down to being a CO. You know, I started being a CO in Georgia, but I went to Florida Department of Corrections, bumped all the way down to being a CO. But when I really found out that I was leaving was when I was in a staff meeting with my warden at the time, a coworker of mine that was also a deputy warden. He was also an assistant warden. And we're all sitting there with the regional director, which is the warden's boss. And he had just done a site visit. He walked around and, looked at some things, and, he had some things to say about, what we needed to do better and whatnot, making sure inmates had their hair cut, making sure things were clean, making sure certain things were the way that he liked it. And, you know, eh, experience had taught me, like, "You just sit down there and shut up. Don't say anything." Well, my coworker, he says, "Sir, we're trying to do the best that we can. We're working to try to get some of these things resolved, but you know, we do have some staffing constraints. I mean, we don't have a lot of people working here, and we're doing the best that we can." He essentially said that we're doing the best that we can. Well, this regional director replies with, you know, being short staffed is not an excuse. If you'd like, I could send you a detailed column that I wrote about how you can mitigate staffing shortages and how to work around not having enough people to do the job. Essentially, like I said, I hate to use profanity, essentially told him to fuck off. And that in that instance, I knew for certain I'm not working in this place no more. This place doesn't care about improving things. This place doesn't care about, having compassion for people. This place doesn't care about, you know, um, making things safe. And that's your warden's boss. That's your regional director. If he doesn't care, why is anybody going to care? So that was probably more alarming thing that I dealt with. I know that's not that extreme of maybe what you would expect to hear from a prison story, but a lot of the stuff that happens in prisons, whether you're staffed or not, would alarm the public if you ever told them. I mean, I've seen dudes take their last breath. I've seen cells covered in blood, an 8 by 10 cell, covered in blood, maybe a half inch thick on the floor because a dude had just, cut his own throat, cut his wrist. Those kind of things don't really bother me. I guess you could say maybe I'm desensitized. Maybe that's a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe. But those kind of things are not out of the ordinary. If you work in corrections, and you quickly find out if you're made for that profession or if you're not. And I know correctional agencies around the nation, Georgia is not an aberration. You could go to, what do you think those guys are dealing with at Rikers Island? What do you think these guys are dealing with at your toughest Texas state prisons? Hell, even California state prisons. I mean, there's places where bloodbath, that's a regular thing, where gang wars are initiated, where guys that, kill themselves or, just engage in self-harm, those kind of things regardless of whether you have staff or not, are going to happen. And those kind of things aren't, I could tell you some stories, but, they're not really to me of note when it comes to the bigger issue that Georgia's facing.
Wow. Um, Boy, a lot of I'm sure we could talk for hours, so to speak, as it relates to your stories that you have. Is there anything else that you'd like to impart to the audience, Russell?
Yeah, I'd just say that your corrections agencies nationwide are facing some of these same challenges as far as, a lot of people don't want to work in prisons. You see that the way that the media depicts our police, our immigration enforcement. And I'm not saying whether I'm for or against what's going on. I'm just saying, like, the negative perception that is placed on our policing nationwide. That same perception is kind of in a smaller note the way that people look at correctional officers. And correctional officers are the very foundation of what keeps the criminal justice system intact. They're these guys just don't go away once they're arrested, sentenced. When you think about the guy that, oh well, this family that I know, her little girl was molested, sexually assaulted. The guy was convicted of doing that. He doesn't just go away. He goes to a correctional facility for, us to manage. So we're in the business of managing customers. We're in the customer service business. Only deal is these people don't want customer service. They're, not all people that go to prison are bad. I'm not even implying that, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are bad people. A lot of them, some of them never coming home. Some of them go to prison with no intent to change. And there are a lot of that do try to change, but I'd say that um the chief concern over what's going on in Georgia prisons, the chief concern is that it's unfair to the public. It's unfair to the taxpayers that are contributing money for this correctional system, this correctional agency to manage, the essentially the rejects of society. Because most of us normal people, we don't go to prison. Even if we get arrested for, a drunken night or something, we don't go to prison. That you got to do some pretty serious stuff a lot of times to, be sentenced to prison. And, they're the taxpayers make contributions for that agency to manage some of Georgia's toughest individuals in the state. To make people that don't want to be incarcerated. The fences don't keep them there, the COs do. And the facility I was at, 170 vacancies. I mean, how do you even justify that? At a close security facility, 170 vacancies. So I'd say that the chief um, wrongdoing here is to the public, because it's not going to be too long for one of these inmates escapes. And if you're one of these people living in the state of Georgia near one of these correctional facilities that you probably know is around you, I would be really concerned, because when one of these inmates escapes and hijacks your car or tries to, that's something you got to consider, and that's something that the public shouldn't have to consider. And so I'd say that's the number one thing that that's wrong about the situation. But number two, I said that a lot of the people that go to prison are bad people. Well, not all of them are bad people. And when you send somebody to prison that actually could change, they have the capacity to change. They have the will, some of them even the willingness to change. But then they don't have any gang affiliation. They go to prison and they're being subjected to, hey, it's either, give me your commissary goods, or I'm going to rob you, or I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to rape you. And there's no COs around to do anything about it. So it's unfair to the families. I mean, Tyler touched. He shares stuff sometimes about it. When I was employed with Georgia Department of Corrections, I used to kind of scoff at the people that were, always crying for prison reform and, um, quote unquote, sympathetic to the inmates, that kind of thing. But that was because at the time I was too in the middle of what was going on to realize the big picture. And the big picture is that these guys are sent to prison. They're not, all of them aren't given a death sentence. And as Tyler touched on, the amount of deaths, the amount of suicides, the amount of homicides skyrocketed in Georgia prisons. And to think that a lot of those guys that probably got killed were probably trying to change their life for the better, probably trying to make some big plans when they got out. Maybe they had family members looking forward to seeing them when they got out of prison. Maybe they had kids that were waiting on them. Maybe they had a mom, a dad that would like to see them, and it was just taken away from them because some some violent inmates, so that had no intention of changing, killed them, and there were no officer around to keep that from happening. There were no officers around to conduct searches to make sure guys didn't have weapons, cell phones, drugs, things like that. So I'd say that the top two things, man, the public is in danger from what's going on, and the inmates' families. I mean, they're being subjected to not knowing whether their loved one's going to make it home alive. So I hope it gets better, man. I'm not here to trash Georgia Department of Corrections employees. I still know a good deal of people that work with that agency. You know, I was employed for years with them, and a lot of good people still work for that agency, and a lot of good people, you know, are committed to serving, and some of them on the doorstep of retirement. Some of them just got there, and I'm not in no way trying to trash what they have going on. You know, those that I have high regards for, they know who they are. But what I am gonna trash is the executive management. Something's got to change, man. Something's got to change, and I don't know how to go about that. You know, I don't know how many articles the Atlanta Journal Constitution can write about them before they get the message. I don't know how many videos can be posted on social media before they. But it's going to take something drastic. You know, Tyler referenced it. Why are they not bringing in the National Guard? You know, why are they not offering massive hiring bonus? Because they have the money. You know, because you know how budgeting works. That money's already allocated. And you could say you're paying overtime, yeah, but overtime at the facility I was at, that's not going to amount to 170 vacancies. I'm not a math major, but 170 vacancies of $43,000 a year, that's not even including the, you know, sergeants, lieutenants. They make more money than that. The math is not adding up. You don't have to be a math major to understand that. So why are they not why are they not issuing sign-on bonuses? Why are they not making a deal with the Georgia National Guard to bring them in? Florida facilities, they brought the National Guard in, and you know, I think Tyler said that, you know, his response of what he was told by the assistant commissioner is, oh, well, it'll take too long to train them. And, you know, a lot of them are females. Well, first off, there's a lot more males in the National Guard than females. I don't know where you got that from. But second off, you know, you can place them in some of your auxiliary posts that, you know, they're not even dealing with inmates. You know, you can put them in your perimeter patrols. You can put them in your entrance area. You can put them in your housing unit control rooms where, you know, they don't have any contact with the inmates. The inmates, they're not around them, you know, and they're just pushing buttons essentially. You know, you could put you could use your Georgia National Guard if you wanted to. So that's a false narrative that I, that's not, it's just not true. Yeah, and Brian Kemp is complicit in this too. The governor, he's complicit in this too. I mean, I don't know how else what else he needs to be told that, you know, his agency, his largest law enforcement agency under his watch is a dumpster fire, an absolute grilled cheese sandwich out of the dishwasher dumpster fire. I mean, that's the state that they're in. Which once used to be a very proud agency. You know, my father told me a bunch of stories about how things used to be, and you know, Georgia used to be the model of the nation of how you want to run a prison. Georgia used to be the model, and people used to like what they do. You know, I've got a coworker at the job, a couple coworkers at the job that I work at now, and he always talks about how much he used to love working with the Georgia Department of Corrections. Most of the employees at the facility I'm at now, they come from Florida, but a few of them from Georgia, and they lament about how things used to be, and yeah, it's sad, man. It's truly sad because I used to love my career with the Georgia Department of Corrections, and I really feel for the people still working there. I feel for the inmates incarcerated there, you know, the ones that are trying to change, not the ones that are, you know, gang members or, well, I mean, some of them are probably trying to change too, but the real hardcore gang members. I don't know if you know this, but you know, I just about put Georgia inmates on par with most every inmates and most every correctional agency's inmates in the nation. I mean, Atlanta, the city of Atlanta is is kind of a sort of a southeast hub for some of these straight street gangs. You know, and there's a reason why if you ever talk to anybody from the state of Georgia, and if you assume they're from Atlanta, they kind of scoff at you if they're not, because Atlanta is almost a different animal than the rest of the state of Georgia. A lot of the rest of the state of Georgia is rural, you know, small towns, you know, country living kind of deal. You know, and the city of Atlanta is just kind of its own thing. Well, a lot of the inmates you get are from the city of Atlanta. A lot of them are hardcore 93 gangster bloods. A lot of them are hardcore GDs. A lot of them are hardcore Crips. You know, so you get some of the most tough, violent inmates in the state of Georgia to manage, and then you don't have any staff to manage them. Man, it's beyond reproach. I mean, it's unimpeachably awful. in the state of Georgia Department of Corrections right now. So yeah, that's all I got, man.
Well, wow. I given what Tyler had mentioned when I had him on, I mean, I'm not surprised that this is going on. And I mean, he made some comments about some of these people in positions of power as being part of the same club or clique, and that there's that some of this is maybe by design.
Yeah, I completely believe there's something going on behind the scenes. I originally thought it was mostly just them all trying to, keep their benefits, keep their pay, and not, not shake the boat, so to speak. A lot of your regional directors, your assistant commissioners, a lot of them are on the doorstep of retirement. There are a lot of older men and women. A lot of people that are when they came in, it was a completely different agency. So, and I respect older people. I respect seniors, people that have seen a lot and done a lot. But also, I'm also a big advocate for sometimes you just need some fresh blood, and in Georgia, I mean, they just have to fire everybody and start from scratch. I mean, they have to go through go back to the sports franchise thing, a rebuild, because they're what they have now is so infected that it's you're not going to be able to heal the body of that agency without just firing everybody, including probably your board of corrections. I mean, you just need to fire everybody, and Tyler's a good guy, man. Tyler, I actually worked for him at one time. I was a sergeant when he was a he was a lieutenant at Valdosta State Prison. I was a sergeant there, and he was a good dude, man. He was a good supervisor, and everything he says is completely true, man. Everything he says is completely true, and he's just like me, a strong love for Georgia Department of Corrections, and it's sad to see where it's at, man. And when I was leaving Georgia Department of Corrections, I had an informal exit interview with the regional director, who was actually not the regional director, the facilities director, and he was actually directly responsible for promoting me. And at the time, him promoting me was kind of unprecedented because I believe I was 27. I was the youngest deputy warden in the state history. I believe. I think I was the youngest captain too. I was 24 when I got promoted to captain, and he was the guy that chose me to be that in that position. And so I think he was pretty frustrated when he found out that I was leaving, and did an exit interview with me, and I was telling him where I was going, going to Florida, and how I know that it's a lot better in a lot better state than Georgia is, and he made all these kind of excuses, like Florida is a bigger state, bigger population, they've got more revenue to use, and I'm like, dude, Georgia has state income tax, Florida doesn't. What are you talking about? I hear what you're saying, but you're acting like you don't have the resources like, you know, Delta Airlines, like Coca-Cola. They're right there in your backyard, and you guys are getting millions of dollars of tax dollars from them every year. You're telling me you don't have the money? You have 170 vacancies at this prison I'm working at. What are you talking about, dude? Like, so just an arrogance, just it seems like it really is some kind of secret society, some kind of, collusion that you have going on. Maybe they're pocketing some of that money. Who knows? That wouldn't surprise me at all. But one of the problems with Georgia too, I didn't mention this, is a lot of their auditing, a lot of their, reviews and looking in the mirror stuff is their own people auditing them. So how can you fully find out where you're at if your buddy is the one looking over your stuff? Everybody's familiar with nepotism and favoritism, those sort of things. Well, if if all you're doing is self-auditing, and then when another agency comes in and audits you and tells you how messed up you are, and you tell them to go kick rocks, how can you expect to make any progress? I mean, that's just madness, and it's completely gaslighting to us people that, one of the greatest things about me coming to work for some other correctional facility, correctional agencies, is you find out that not everywhere is like that. I was just convinced that, like, well, every prison must be crazy short like this. They're probably going through this in Florida, going through this in South Carolina, New York, California. But then you go to these other places, I know it's just Georgia. Yeah, these other places are going through some challenges, but not to the level Georgia is. I mean, Florida Department of Corrections, I mean, compared to Georgia, I mean, it's like the New York Yankees versus T-ball. I mean, it's that big of a difference. I mean, they're not even playing the same sport. And like I said, man, it's just sad to see where it's gone, and I hope they get some change, man. I hope something, something develops and they're able to change. I wish nothing but the best for them. It's nothing, ill will, nothing like that. It's just unfair to the public and it's unfair to the families of the inmates.
Yeah, when you mentioned about the need to completely reposition everything, you're making me think of just the gov the U.S. government, as well. I mean, basically everything has to be completely repositioned. You can't just replace maybe a couple people here, or do a little facelift. You got to do like triple bypass surgery. Just so, uh, wow. Well, yeah, I'm just kind of collecting everything. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, Russell, to share your thoughts, and appreciate the service that you do. I mean, like, obviously, not everybody is cut out to do a job like that. There's a lot of jobs out there that are thankless, I think, and so appreciate people like you and others who uh, who do the work that a lot of people wouldn't feel comfortable doing. So, there's a lot of I think that's so important because there's so many positions that are glamorized out there, different jobs, but there's some that are so critical and important. People overlook it, and they don't realize that that is actually what's holding society together in many respects. So, um, Russell, how can people learn more about you as well as get in touch with you?
Well, I'm on social media. Russell Zirkle the second's my username on Facebook. I'm on Instagram as well, but Facebook's probably the best way to reach out to me, or you can reach me by email. Russell Dwayne Zirkle at gmail.com. Dwayne spelled Dewayne, so all one word, Russell Dwayne Zirkle at gmail.com. So they can reach me there. They can reach me on social media, and I'll be happy to give any insight to anybody that wants it. Whether that be just people like you and me, or journalists, people looking for quote unquote juicy story, because I could give them some about Georgia, man. It's just hopefully they can spark some change.
Absolutely, yeah. My hope too is that somebody sees this and is able to. So, Russell, be well. Thanks for reaching out, and I'm glad we made the time to, you know, hear your hear your story, hear your take on things, and we'll be in touch.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the platform.
Appreciate you tuning in and watching. If you enjoyed it, if you enjoyed the video, you found value, and I encourage you to like, share, subscribe, /follow. The show is on YouTube and Spotify. Always look forward to your feedback, and appreciate you tuning in. Be well and take care.